Hey, I'm Gabe Smith, and I'm an executive leadership coach and strategist. And today we want to talk about the idea of naming reality. This is the first job of leadership. Here's the deal. I've worked with hundreds of leaders over the last 25 years. And one thing I can tell you is that every leader at some point is stuck. And that just doesn't feel good when you're stuck. So what I'm all about is helping you move from stuck to unstuck. And so today we're going to talk about the idea that there's two main categories of places where we feel stuck in leadership: people and process. And here's what I can tell you. If you'll lean into this conversation today, we're going to guide you through a process of naming the place where you feel stuck and helping you take a first step to get unstuck today. The problem is that, our brains are like computers and we have a limited amount of space on our hard drive. And, naturally, like we're constantly trying to sort through information and get rid of things that like are just clogging up the system and keeping us from doing our best work. And I think this is a space where, it's so important to name where we're stuck, because our reluctance to just name reality means that like we just keep carrying those problems and not doing anything about it.
It's that old adage of insanity definition is trying the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. But that's kind of what happens in leadership and in organizational life, because there's so much going on. You do have to have process, and you have to have norms, and you have to have just ways that things work. But then over time, especially like we'll talk about today, when stuff's changing all around you constantly, like we have right now, it suddenly you get to a place where the stuckness is coming from something that's just needs refreshing. It needs
Right.
a new lens. It needs to work differently now, but we're so used to the old way we can't see it, where it's, the forest for the trees.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're so close, like, because we're in the systems that we're leading, and this is the
Hmm.
problem. And this is the big pitch for like why hire a Steve or a Gabe, like why hire a coach? It's because like even if you're a super capable leader who can advise other people, you can't see your own system because you're part of the dysfunction in the system and you're contributing to it.
Totally. It's why we get questions sometimes like, "Oh, why do you guys hire coaches if you are coaches?" It's like, well, because we're humans, so we have the same exact problems.
That's right.
So, for anyone listening here, the way you can make sure you get these videos, every time we do a new one, we email it out to the list. So, if you're not on the email list, there's a link in the description. Just join it right now. If you're not on that list, you're crazy, because we put a lot of good stuff out, both with these videos and other weekly helpful blurbs. So, people in process, I mean, where do you want to start with this one?
Well, I think I just want to start with normalizing this idea that we're all stuck at some level. Like, I don't think there's a leader out there, myself included, who, if we're being honest with ourselves and with each other, wouldn't say like, man, there's just a thing I feel stuck. Like I don't, and by stuck, I mean, let's define our terms. That means like a problem that you keep solving over and over and over again, which means you're not actually solving it, or it's a burden that you're carrying. There's just a tension that you're living with that maybe can't even define, but you're carrying it. And so in both those ways, like leaders are always stuck in some way. And so the question is like, how do we navigate through that? And the first thing is we have to say things out loud. That's why say the line, I think the first job of leadership is naming reality, is that. So that's the first component I think we need to start with, is just an exercise in vulnerability to say, hey, hello, I'm stuck and this is where. And that's part of what, we want to work through today.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was looking back over some data just from the past years of clients we've worked with, and looking at what they said when they came to us. And the most consistent phrase was this one. People would say, "I just don't know where to start,"
Right.
which I think kind of proves and highlights the point you just made, that the stuckness results in not knowing how to solve your own problem, not knowing how to get out of that. It's like, I don't know what I don't know.
Right.
I don't know where to start. So if I don't know how to get myself out of stuckness, that means I need someone else. And someone else can only help if they hear the problem. This was something, actually, you helped me learn this a lot a few years ago, is I realized like I wouldn't name those things enough for others to be able to help. It's like if they don't know about
Right.
that stuckness, then I can't get the like somebody to intervene and break that stuck cycle. So I think that's another
Right.
value in naming it.
It is. And I think like where we're stuck in our stuckness to go a layer deeper is really this idea of imposter syndrome, which, that'll, I'm sure, be a topic we'll cover on a different day in depth. But imposter syndrome means like I'm basically afraid of being found out, that I really don't know what I'm doing. And I would also tell you, after again working with hundreds of leaders over the past 25 years, I've never met a leader who didn't suffer from imposter syndrome at some level. I'd say if you don't at some level, you're probably a sociopath, because like we all just have it in some way, like realize like we don't have it together, we don't have the solution, and so we're reluctant to name problems because that would expose us, that like we're
Mhm.
not actually competent. But it's what I think, again, we want to normalize this problem of being stuck and saying, hey, if you're stuck, you're not alone. You're in good company. The greatest leaders in the world today are stuck right now in some way. So let's
Yeah.
move through, like, what does it look like to get unstuck? And I think like that's where we want to name the two main areas that in leadership we're stuck, and that's people and process. So let's start with the hardest one first, people. And
Yeah.
I'll just ask you, Steve, like when you think about being stuck with a people problem, tell me, like in general, how does that feel? Like as a leader, how do you feel when you're stuck with a people problem?
I just want to bury it and run away and go focus on the process problems. I think
Spoken like a
it's a
true
control.
engineer.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a control issue. It's like, well, people problems are complicated and messy and gray, and that does not feel very controllable or completable. It's kind of like you hear this a lot from leaders. I feel this all the time. At some point, as you move up, you move away from to-do lists, you can just check things off, and it moves into things like people problems or larger problems that can't be checked off. And so a
Right.
lot of times when I'm coaching leaders, we come up with little mechanisms and ways to create checkable things every day so you can actually feel completion and not just be in despair that you're not actually accomplishing stuff in your role. And so I think of that right away. People problems, there's not a lot you can just check off. And if you do actually take the steps you need to take, it'll probably make it even more messy before it gets cleaner. And so it's hard, especially if you're in a busy role. I mean, what leader isn't busy today? Then when am I going to do this messy, complicated thing? I don't know. I'll get to it later, you know?
Right. No, I think that's what I've heard and experienced myself too, is that it's that we recognize, rightly so, that solving people problems is not a fast fix. Like it's going to take time and it's going to require us to slow down. I think like slow literally is a 4-letter word in leadership circles. Like, no, I don't want to move slow. I want to move fast. But, there was a saying when I was in the Army, when you're learning how to do room clearing in urban operations, it's one of the most dangerous things you can do in a combat situation is, move in and clear a city block, because there's so many unknowns. There's so many places for bad guys to hide out. And the temptation
Right.
of young leaders in that situation is to rush in. I want to rush in and do it as fast as I can. But when you rush in, you make a lot of mistakes. You don't see what's around the next corner, and you fail. And so that was a line that I remember being taught as we were learning those techniques, was slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And
Yeah.
so we want to move fast. Like speed is like a force multiplier. Speed is something like that we want to be identified with. But in order to go fast, we have to sometimes slow down, because slowing down is smooth. And when it comes to people, what we want is slowing to smooth. And so that like we can go fast, because there's nothing slower than ignoring people problems that aren't going away. And then here's the thing, if you don't deal with them at a time and a place of your choosing, you will deal with them at a time and a place not of your choosing, at an
Yes.
inopportune moment where you want to talk about slowing down your operation. Get ready.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the most convincing argument I've ever heard, because if it's gonna have to happen, I don't want it to be even more catastrophic. Which one thing that's led to for me and a few leaders that I've worked with is coming up with a way. It's almost like a forcing mechanism to slow down when you need to think through or plan those steps. And for me, it's a walk. So
Mm.
something I've come to feel pretty strongly about actually is we're in front of these laptops all the time and these phones, and they're screaming at us because there's always an email, there's always a notification, there's always like a task right there, which makes it very hard to then disconnect, slow down, and do what we're talking about. So for me, what works is going on a walk, because on a walk, the distractions are gone, but also my thoughts can flow more smoothly. The best coach I ever had said, when you're mentally tired, do something physical. When you're
Mm,
physically tired, do something mental.
so good.
So good. And it translates very well to the fact that, like, when you need to do something mental, move physically instead of sitting there staring
Yep,
static.
that's right.
So, I mean, this could look a number of different ways. For me, it tends to be a walk. Okay. You and I talked about this it was like a couple of weeks ago. There was a people
Mhm.
problem and you were helping me think through it. And what I did right after that was I went on a walk and kind of planned my next steps. And it worked so well. Like, I had been staying in the stuckness for so long, and staring at the computer would also make it worse. But I guess the point is something that is a concrete mechanism to help you slow down and
Right.
do that thinking.
Right. We're always talking about, our roots up approach. Like the roots are the habits and the rhythms and the things that I need to implement in my life in order to get at the intentional goals that I need to achieve. So like with people, like that's what you're naming is like a root for you is, hey, in order to slow down, I need a habit for you. And I think that's just a great point, Steve. It's physical, it's like because it's something to do. And I think like when you're dealing
Yeah.
with relational issues, it feels like I don't know what to do. I don't know
Like,
where, right? Like I can't do anything right now except for worry. But you're like, well,
mhm,
you could go for a walk and you could like slow down your thinking and really think
yeah.
more carefully about, this particular problem. So I'd love to jump into like maybe just naming some different ways that we get stuck with people in general, just so that like if you're listening to this, maybe you identify with one of these, maybe like what the burden you're carrying is a people problem, and it'll be helpful to get at that a little bit more specifically. So I think one of those is when you have a person on your team, and right now I'm thinking, if you're listening to this, you're a leader, you have a team of leaders working for you, and let's just say you've got one of those leaders whose behavior is detrimental to the mission. And so there's something that they're doing where there's a way they're showing up. Maybe they're passive aggressive. Maybe they're that person that, won't say the thing on the meeting, but loves to send a Slack message afterward
Yeah.
without context. We've all experienced that. But whatever it is, there's a dysfunctional behavior that you've noticed. And again, we go back to this question of like, when there's a leader with a dysfunctional behavior on your team, how do we experience that? Like, what would you say, Steve? Like when you've experienced that, like what sort of feelings do you have? Like when there's somebody that's not behaving well?
Uh, yeah. I mean, for me, it's usually some form of dread,
Right.
because, and for me, this is where like my engineering brain comes in. The stuff that feels the worst to me is stuff that's recurring.
Right.
So recurring behavior, it's like, because it's not just a one and done fix. This is like going to keep happening.
Yep.
Often what it can be followed by, and this, everyone will relate to this. I call them energy suckers. Some people call them energy vampires, but the person who has that behavior tends to walk in the room and suck the life right out of the room. And everyone can feel it. And it could be hard to name sometimes, but they bring the culture down many notches just by their presence. And
Yep.
so it's like, this is such a big, hairy problem. But what I'll say is almost every time I've seen a person like that in a team, they are also one of the most talented, which is
Mm,
why they've been able to hang around.
right. They have value in
And
some
so
other way.
that's yes. So that's always part of the hard part, because it's like, you've heard it too. It's the leader can give a million excuses why we need to excuse the behavior or let it continue.
It's so good. Yeah, we give ourselves a pass, but then like we know that like in retrospect, when we let that behavior continue again, like it doesn't go well. It doesn't actually get better over time. These sorts of problems don't get better by themselves. Given enough time, they actually like fester like an infection.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, okay, well then if we see that there's, behavior that's detrimental, and I love your framework there of, that we've got people who are energy suckers, because sometimes that's all we can name is like, I don't know exactly what it is, but this is a drain on me, on the team, on the organization, and we don't name it. So to go back to our first principle of leadership, naming reality, that's our first job, but we don't name it. And I think sometimes we don't name that reality because we feel inept that we can't name the specific problem. But what I would say here is I just want to give leaders listening permission to say, just name what you're feeling. Like that's actually enough to name what
Yeah.
you're experiencing. My favorite book on how to have difficult conversations is this book called Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott. If you've never read it, I highly recommend picking it up. She gives a really simple framework for how to engage tough conversations. And her thing is like, name what you observe and then name how you're experiencing that. And
Hmm.
then she has this great line. She says, and then let silence do the heavy lifting. Like, so it's enough to name like, hey, Steve, this is, I, I observed, you doing this thing, and that like you keep not naming something in a meeting and then sending a passive aggressive, tone message afterward. And here's how I experienced that is it actually makes me angry. And I think we're so reluctant to name negative emotion because we're afraid of what that negative emotion might do. But what I can tell you is like we've got to learn to be more candid and just naming the behavior, naming how we're experiencing it. So it's not like here's how the team's experiencing it, here's how my boss is, it's here's how I'm experiencing it. Like own it. Or it
Yeah.
just makes it makes me not trust you. Or it's like I question whether we're on the same team, and then you can give people an opportunity to respond to that because it's actually not accusing or blaming, it's literally owning your experience of the person.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, what so many people are afraid of, and this is when I experience big time, is you're just afraid of upsetting them or
Right.
creating tension. And like one of the things I've had to work on in my mindset is, okay, but Steve, like if I name something that's just true about what they're doing and how it affects me, and they go off the rails or get mad or they're upset in some way, that's their problem. Because
Right.
it's weird how often this happens, especially leaders. We tend to it's like we got there because we're people pleasers and hard workers and achievers. So it's like what we do is we take it on ourselves. I'm like taking it on myself that I need to make sure they stay happy. And if I say something that makes them unhappy, that's somehow on me. And it's really helped. It sounds so basic, but it's really helped for me to just remind myself in that moment, like, no, that's their problem if they're upset about the reality. And all I'm
Right.
doing is kindly naming it because I'm
Right.
not doing anything wrong by doing that. But one of the things that can help then to even enter the conversation is, like you said, just kind of naming how you're feeling, naming the elephant in the room. So, Sunday on our team always says, just say the first sentence out of your mouth should be, all right, Gabe, I need to have a tough conversation with you.
Yeah.
And like that very phrase kind of like allows us to enter into it versus, and you see this a lot with feedback in team settings, especially, is a lot of dancing around the thing before
Yeah.
getting to it, which actually just magnifies the pain.
Right.
So I'm a big fan of just getting right to it and just naming, even if I'm nervous, like naming, I'm nervous to start this conversation, but we need to have a tough conversation.
No, I think that's such a good word. Yeah. And like you said, not overly owning the other person's feelings or the outcome, neither of which is in our span of control, and I think
Hmm.
sometimes what we're inadvertently doing when we, hedge on what we're saying is what we're trying to do is actually manipulate and control the other person's response in a way that we feel would be less hard, but it's actually incredibly unkind and deceptive in some ways because like we can't control other people's feelings or outcomes at the end of the day. We can only control our input, what we're willing to share. And there's
Yeah.
ways that ripples through a culture, right? Like if as a leader, leaders set the tone for the organization. So if you're a leader who doesn't address problems, I just met with a client recently that, this is the dynamic in his organization is, he's got a boss that doesn't name things. And then what happens is things fester and then blow up. And so, what we talked about is like, wouldn't it be better if we just had a series of smaller conversations, which also I'm a big fan of this idea of iterative conversations. So sometimes we think like, I need to solve a people problem all in one big catalytic moment. And certainly there's times where that's either the only option or appropriate. But I think most people problems, a better approach is hey, like what truth could I name today? Even if it's not the full thing, but we get moving down the road of like naming the thing. And
Yeah.
I might have to have two more conversations to really get at it, but that's okay. That's not failure.
Yeah. I agree so much. That's why I'm such a big fan of regular one-on-ones where you always, always, always ask the question, what's something that's not working well? And it's funny because sometimes you get into that scenario and there isn't, like, you don't have something that's
Right.
bugging you, but you
Yeah.
still kind of do the practice of coming up with something as tiny as it might be. Like, I don't know, Gabe, you always leave your Skittles on the counter and
It's a slob.
it's such a slob. You're just coming up with something because the point isn't really the feedback as much as it is the habit and rhythm of small, regular
Mhm.
conversations so that we're not avoiding and getting scared of it.
Right. And I think that last piece of like giving the person a chance to weigh in and respond. So after you kind of name the thing and name how you're experiencing it, and then giving them an opportunity to say like what do you think, like what's your perspective, and then you just move to listening mode. And so there's that like necessary shift that we have to make in these kinds of conversations from, oh, I have to ramp up and get the courage to like name it, but then actually need to pretty quickly downshift into a listening mindset. And something I tell leaders all the time is like, hey, physically just pull out your notebook and move to taking like written notes, because that physical act will like help you downshift from telling to listening.
That really works. And yeah, just to put a cap on that point, because I think this is huge. There's a company we work with I'm thinking of where they have built that culture. It's like the culture by accident thing. Unintentionally have this culture where the feedback and the thing isn't named when it's small. And so then the festering until it blows up happens. But what it's created is a culture where time and time again, great people leave. And what's so sad about it is it started with something so tiny that just
Right.
festered too long. Like it could have really been avoided because there wasn't a huge disconnect of values or skills or competencies or any of that. It was just these tiny things that never got addressed that build into big things until one day they're like, I'm out of here, you know?
That's right.
And that's when it feels sad to me. Like, oh gosh, that could have been avoided.
Right. But then it's a snowball effect, and then it really is too big to handle. There's too many peripheral problems that have been created in
Right.
the road.
You got to recognize your biggest component of your talent brand is what people say to their friends at dinner after they leave your company.
Right.
So, how many millions are spent on talent branding when actually, like, well, everyone tells stories about their employer and they're honest with their friends. And it's either most of the time it's a bad story, and then occasionally it's a great story. Well, to me, these are the things that are the payoff that makes it worth doing the hard stuff.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, there's probably a lot more we could say about people, but I think we probably need to pivot to process. We'll come back to people. People's our business. So I think a lot of these,
We got a
these
little bit to say on it.
Yeah, just a little bit to say. But yeah, the second piece is the process. So sometimes it's not an issue with people, it's an issue with process. And by the way, this is really important to name when you name, like, because a lot of times it'll be like, I feel a tension, or I know something's not working. And we actually don't slow down and ask, is it a people problem or is it a process problem? And often you'll see a dynamic where people think it's a people problem, but actually it's a process problem. And we don't want to get that wrong, because if you go down the road, incorrect diagnosis leads to, you know, unhelpful solutions.
Yeah.
This is an important question. Like, is this really a problem with people, or is it a problem with process? And, there was a general, I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book and he said, when there's a problem in my command, I begin searching for the origins of the problem by drawing a circle around my own 2 feet. In other words, like, where I as a leader own, because as leaders, we own like our whole organization. I mean, the buck stops with us and our, sphere of influence. And so like with process, you might see a behavior, but then if you dig deep enough, you realize like there's a system that's just not serving us well any longer, that maybe used to be good and now isn't good,
What do you
and that
think's
might
the
be.
appropriate time to do that kind of assessment, to ask that question?
Yeah, well, I think it's when you're feeling tension, when you realize like I'm stuck in a situation that I can't resolve, then the first
Mm.
question is like, is this people or is this process, or is it both? That's an option too. There's a little of both in the mix. But like often what happens with process problems is they have almost always have negative effects on people. And
Yeah.
so where you see this most commonly is in poor communication. And so there's a and what happens is that like when a business is small, you have a certain system, a way of communicating. You might have, for instance, one meeting, like where you just need one meeting a week and you have everybody in there. And that works like when you're small and we can all, see each other and communicate. But then when you scale and now you're 5 times that size, but let's just say you don't pivot and now you're still trying to operate out of a one meeting mindset. And what happens is you haven't created the space for appropriate communication. Like there's so many people that there's literally not time or room for people to name issues or to collaborate. And then what you see is there's a lot of miscommunication and then you see people not getting along. But if you really like looked carefully at that scenario, what you'd realize is it's not primarily an issue with the people in the room. It's an issue that like you as a leader haven't really scaled your systems and process with the company. And now
Hmm.
like that system that served you well 2 years ago no longer works.
Yeah. What talk about the ways that shows up most often, the communication breakdowns.
Yeah. I mean, when there's communication breakdown, what happens is people don't name, to go back to our previous phrase, they don't name their reality. And we start operating with a lot of assumptions. And so, like, there's just because, like, we don't, and again, we blame time often. That's what I hear. The excuse is we don't have time. That's the first problem. And so you see then people begin running and making decisions with assumptions and then not thinking through who needs to know what when, like that's the big question
Yeah.
with communication. And
Yeah.
so it just breaks down and then people feel left. Then there's all kinds of feelings, right? Like people feel left out or people feel like they should have gotten to, a chance to weigh in, or people were unclear about whose responsibility it was to own the project.
Yeah.
And so all of that lack of clarity equals a lot of people problems, but at the core, it's a process problem that like you don't actually have a good system for managing your communication structure. So that's
I
one
mean,
way I've seen it.
I don't know if it's just because we're recording this in late October, and usually this is the time of year where leadership teams are doing planning and stuff, but man, the amount of calls and messages and coaching sessions these past couple weeks where the problem is we don't know what's going on. Like we're just not actually intellectually aware of the tasks being performed.
Right.
It sounds so basic. It still blows me away how often that's a problem. The call I got yesterday was a leader of a very large organization just going, I don't know what my people are doing.
Mm,
And I don't get updates. How do I get updates?
bingo. That's a great.
And it's like, what a basic thing for such an advanced group of people to struggle with.
Well, and I've seen it and we've helped, we've developed our own. Listeners might be familiar with the EOS model of the entrepreneurial operating system highlighted in the book Traction, which I'm a big fan of. But we've sort of made our own greenhouse version of that. That's a stripped down version because we've actually never seen that system fully work the way it's written in the book. Because usually, you already have, unless you're a brand new organization, then you already have systems and what you need is something to layer on top of that. So particularly what we've taken from that is our leadership team meeting structure that we've helped numerous clients implement just this year. And, the typical leadership team meeting, what happens is, either there's no agenda or like one person creates the agenda. And the bottom line is like we end up not talking about the most important things or the loudest voice gets the most attention. And so what our model forces is we force teams to think 90 days at a time about their most important challenges, create goals, and then we have a system of like managing that 90-minute meeting so that they talk about agreed upon most important things in an orderly way and
Yeah.
assign the appropriate responsibilities coming out of that. But that's just an example of like there's so many, I'd say more often than not, leaders don't have a good structure for their team meeting, and that's a place that's just like low hanging fruit. Like
Yeah.
if you dread your weekly meeting, or if you just feel like your weekly meeting is chaos, like that's a great starting point for process.
Yeah, those are great indicators right there. If you're feeling that dread or chaos about your meeting. And leaders, I'll give you a freebie here. You can send this video to your direct reports. If your weekly meeting, your monthly meeting, whatever it is off the rails, they need to work on how to bring updates to the meeting. And it's also your job to help train them, but it's their job to work on the skill, because the number of times we dig into this and the real issue is that people don't come prepared. So then a question comes to them and they're like thinking out loud in the moment. You're like, this meeting is a $10,000 meeting. You can't be thinking off the cuff right now. Like, you needed to have thought through priorities, thought through updates, executive summaries. How are you sharing what matters in a concise way? Boom, boom. What's the next steps? What are my recommendations? Like, you got to have a way that people prep for these updates, and they have to be practiced at it. But that's a rarity to come by that. So I think
That's
it's
right.
on both parties to work on it. But I've seen it so often and been thinking about it lately. Okay,
Mm,
then they do have the rhythm, they do have the agenda, but people's updates are terrible and they clearly haven't prepped because,
right.
again, they're too busy.
That's right.
Well, here's the other clip you can send to your team leaders. Nothing else on their calendar is as important as prepping for your leadership team meeting.
Yeah. Well, and that's the idea that on a leadership team, it's the idea of number one team, like that there's the team you're on and there's the team you're leading. And this is something I've seen messed up a lot, is that if you're an executive leader, then the executive team is your number one team. That's your bosses, that's the CEO's meeting, and your primary job is being on that team. And so that's the team you're on. And then the team you lead is your team, the team in the meeting that you lead. But we get that confused, and we think our number one team is the team we're leading, but it's not. It's the team you're on is the most important, to prep and be prepared and be ready to show up as your best self. But I think often what happens is we just sort of show up to those meetings, we're screaming in from, eight other things on our calendar. And to your point, Steve, like not prepared and not really with a sense of ownership, like, oh, this is just a thing I have to go to. What I really need to get to and prepare for is my team meeting, which you do. I'm not saying don't prepare for that, but like, hey, your first priority is the team you're on, because that's where everything else flows out of.
Was out of, yeah. It's kind of, I mean, it's similar to how we all treat work and family. It's like family is just the thing we do. And so we're not like prepping for it. We're not being so intentional with it. But then work, we're super intentional because that's where the paycheck is and that's where we're getting judged and we have a performance review. And so it's really similar. Like, I'm always telling leadership teams, like, that meeting is your most important one of the week, but you're all treating it like the least important one of the week.
That's
And
right.
it's crazy how backwards it can get. Well, it might not be the most fun one, or it might not be like the most novel thing or whatever, but
That's
it's
right.
actually the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all about priorities, and those are choices that we make, and that we have radical responsibility for the choices we make in life, because life is just a series of our choices. That's what it is. That's how we get, from point A to point B in work and life. There's another dynamic that I wanted to name, and that's the seasonality of solving process problems, because I just want to acknowledge that there's this reality that, in most businesses, we don't have the luxury of like working on process problems anytime we want, because it's just like doing, maintenance on an aircraft. Like, I mean, we joke around of like, we're building the plane while we're flying it. Well, it's like, okay, everyone would die if you really like play that metaphor out. Right. And so we can't do that. And I'm a big fan of like viewing work life through the lens of agriculture, because I just think there's something beautiful about that, of like, there's different seasons and there's different activities that we ought to prioritize in different seasons. So if you're a farmer, there's a season where, you're preparing the ground, like you're tilling up the hard ground, and you're sowing seed, and it's a planting season, right? And then there's a season of growth where, you're watering and the weather's right for the growth season to happen. And then there's a harvest season where, you actually see the literal fruit of your labor, and the metaphorical revenue comes in. And then there's a very important season that like most people forget about, which is the rest season. If like farming, you can't just use the land over and over and over. You have to rest it. and there's a season of rest after the harvest that's preparing the land and the people and the animals like for the next planting season. And I think business ought to be viewed the same way. Like if you look, across your year as a business leader, it's like, where is the planting season? Is it, I think for a lot of people, that's the fall, like where we're starting new initiatives, like we're tilling up new ground, we're building new relationships. And then there's a growth season where we're just like investing in doubling down on those things and like really doing the disciplines required for those efforts to grow. And then there's a harvest where we're actually seeing the fruit, like the money's coming in, the new deals are closing. And then the season we ignore is the rest season. But I think rest can be viewed a few different ways. Like there's rest in terms of, yeah, we need to give people a break, take 2 weeks of vacation, which I'm a big fan of having a season like that. But I think there's also a place in that rest season where we give ourselves permission to work on the business. So the rest of the year, most of the year we're working in the business, but I think we should be aware as we're working in the business of like where our processes are not up to speed. We're naming those throughout the year, but we may not have the capacity to do anything about it. So then one approach is to name a time of the year. I recommend the rest season is a time to work on the business where things are slower, where you can dismantle things, you can pull things apart without having all the risk of like being in your very busiest season. And that if you think about it, if you did that every year you would fix at least some of the process problems. Every year you would upgrade your organization piece by piece.
Yeah. Uh, it's also interesting to look at different benchmarks or metrics in your business to see where those seasons might naturally lie.
That's right.
And I mean, probably like a lot of businesses, for us, the rest period is most likely in the summer. And something that we did the past few years, it kind of was born out of the pandemic since we had to rethink a lot of these cyclical things. And we turned it into what we were calling the summer project. And so over the summer, we would pick one big working on the business initiative and spend the whole summer on it. And then you come into the fall, which for us is definitely um, like you said, a season of kind of planting and getting things going. And it was really exciting because, okay, we're coming off the heels of creating this, bolstering something that really mattered or getting something really dialed in. The reason I bring it up is because I was just pleasantly surprised at how fun the summer project would be because it was the only time of the year where you could really focus deeply on
Yeah.
something big instead of being so scattered. I think everyone really looked forward to that. And I hadn't experienced that in a work setting before.
Oh, I love that. That's a really cool rhythm.
So let's wrap it there. Like, what is your kind of conclusion on this? Why leaders get stuck, the people problems and the process problems?
Yeah, because leading is hard and complex. And there's a dynamic that, there's a lot of context outside of our control bearing down on all these problems. And so there's the context of most of us are working in a larger organization, or even if we own the organization, we're working in an industry that has all kinds of economic forces that we're not in control of. And there's social things happening culturally beyond our control. And so just to name, like, context gets a vote. And so all these problems don't happen in isolation. They happen in the context of our organizational life, in our industry, and in our world. And just to acknowledge out loud, like, that's why I think it's really hard to name these things, because it can feel overwhelming and outside of our control.
Yeah. Well, this was a fun conversation. And if you want to see what it's like to work with us or dig into any of the things we've talked about today, go over, if you're already on Instagram, just DM the word growth plan and we'll send you the info on what it looks like. If you're not, go over to Instagram, we're Greenhouse Coaching, and DM us the word growth plan.